I'll tell you a little secret, something that I admitted to myself not too long ago. I like making sounds more than I like making music. So much so that every time I want to make music, I pretty much have to start all the sound from scratch. And when I don't do that, when I use something already pre-saved, even something I've made myself, I feel like a fraud. And not only do I like making sounds, I like understanding how sounds are built up and how I can use things that weren't made to produce certain sounds, produce those sounds. And for that, you have to do a lot of sound making and you have to understand it on a very, very deep level. And that is one of the reasons I wanted to build my own sound lab. Not my dream synth, but my sound lab. So what you're seeing right here is the first part of my sound lab. I say first part because I've already started the second part over here, but yeah, we're just gonna have a look at this one. So here we have my Modular version 1. It is the result of over a year of planning, resource gathering, research, component sourcing, soldering, and also a lot of interaction with a lot of synth nerds and DIY electronics nerds on forums and in Discord groups. And yeah, I have done a lot of building. Now, the final price tag for all of this is actually not as high as it should be. And there are lots of reasons for that, but I'll save that for later because first I want to show you the specs of this thing. So I've split up all of my modules into 4 sections. The first one being sound generators. And here we can find the Moog Mavis, of course, because it has an oscillator. But then there is a second oscillator, which is actually my main oscillator. Now, I chose the orbital because on top of providing me with all the basic waveforms, it also has support for FM synthesis, both exponential and linear. Plus, it also does oscillator sync. But for these features, you actually need to have a second oscillator, and that's what I'm using the Mavis for. Now, on top of the oscillator outputs, I also needed all the types of noise I could get my hands on. This module here in particular produces 5 types of noise. Now, if you take all of that and you add the horror show noise output, I now have all the types of noise I could possibly need to do any types of sound. Next up, we have the sound and signal processors, and first up we have two 4-pole ladder filters, whereas one of them is an authentic Moog 4-pole ladder filter. These are low-pass filters, and so they will cut off high frequencies and let the low frequencies pass through. Now, the Voyager doesn't sing as cleanly as the Moog filter does, but if you are looking for something more untamed, the Voyager filter is great, and it has switchable slopes. You can run it at 1, 2, 3, or 4 poles. Now, for those of you who might be into Eurorack bass, you really want to explore stuff like wave folding and wave shaping, including ring modulation, because these types of synthesis methods can create really rich overtones in a waveform, and the way they work on bass is just delicious. So, in my rack, I got the wave folder inside the Mavis, which sounds great like a classical wave folder, however, you cannot modulate it. So I also added the Avalon Harmonics wave folder, which can be modulated, and then on top of that, I've got an Elisa 1377 inspired wave shaper that sounds amazing. It is very modulatable, and it can also work like a crossfade between two sources. Now, I get my ring modulation filled from the Frequency Central horror show, because not only does it output a horribly sounding noise that I love, no, it also offers up ring modulation, and on top of that, it also works like a sub-octaver. Now, this circuit right here, the Barton Musical Circuit's Wave Phase Animator, does one thing. And a lot of my Modular People friends told me that it's not that useful because it only does this one thing and it does a specific thing. But for those of you who have been following my channel for some time, you'll understand why I wanted to put an instant super saw module in there. And that's all it does. Now, the rectifier inverter is a module that lies very close to my heart because it is the result of me finding an underdeveloped idea for a rectifier online, taking it to the Morris Klein Discord group and saying, hey, check this out. Them going like, hey, this is underdeveloped. And then over the course of several days, just improving on that idea until they had this for me. It was one of the most fun projects I've had in a long time. And I'm so grateful, guys. Thank you. So what does the rectifier aka wave record do? Well, it is in the name, the first name, rectifier. It rectifies, attenuates, and it inverts. But in layman terms, it takes a bipolar waveform and then it splits it down the middle. So it takes the plus side and the minus side and outputs them individually. And on top of that, it combines those two sides back again, which is completely uninteresting because you're ending up with the original waveform. Well, it gets interesting when you consider the fact that there's a second input where you can put in some other type of waveform. And now you're combining the plus side from one of them and the minus side from the other one, and you end up with a Frankenstein waveform. It is a wave surgeon. This module is one of the reasons I wanted to become a Modular People, because I've been seeking out these types of weird little modules to do things that nothing else really does. So yeah, if I ever got to put something like this into a music app after working with a developer for quite some time, I would. And I'm not saying I have, I'm just saying that maybe you should stay tuned. Let's just move on to the next category. Alright, so modulators, triggers, sequencers, and clock. Now, I wanted to have a lot of options when it came to envelopes and LFOs, so starting out with the envelopes, we got a straight up ADSR envelope in the Moog Mavis, and then we have this module down here from Barton Musical Circuits that basically just outputs 4 very short envelopes. It's literally just the decay stage, and this short type of envelope is perfect for percussion and drum sounds. Now, this module here, LFO slew envelope, great name on a module that does exactly those things, is more intricate because it can work as an envelope and work as an LFO. It is reshapeable and very slewable, and on top of that, this thing also outputs pulse signals. So you can use that for triggering other envelope modules if you want, and you can also use it as a clock signal. Oh, and a fun fact here, this LFO slew envelope module was designed by a guy named Jonathan Liljedahl, and he's the guy behind the company Chematica. And if you recognize these names, it might be because you're an AUM fan. That's right, the same guy who made AUM for iOS is also a Modular People. Now, one of these days, I'll be buying a mix trails from him because it literally looks like having an AUM mixer strip in your rack. Another fun fact is that this is actually one out of 2 Swedish modules that I have in this rack. And both of them are sporting Swedish custom-made knobs. Now there is one more envelope-specific module in here, and it's this one from Feedback Devices. It is a very essential module together with an amp module if you want to make your own compressor or ducking setup. And that's what I use it for mostly. Now, when it comes to LFOs, I've got some analog ones, like the one in the LFO slew envelope, then there is one in the Moog Mavis, one in the Dreadbox Utopia, even though that one only has one waveform, and then there's the digital stuff like the Europis from Allen Synthesis. Now these are running on Raspberry Pi computers, and they contain a bunch of different scripts, and whenever you select a script, the module basically becomes whatever that script is. One of those features is a 6 times LFO output with independent rates and waveforms. That is pretty powerful, right? And then on top of that, if you check through the scripts, there is an envelope script in here. And here is also where we get into sequencing and clock and all of the other types of utilities you might want, like Bernoulli gates, master clock, probabilistic, CV outputs in here. There's even stuff like quantizer, Turing machine. If you're into Pam's workout kind of stuff, there's a script for that too. And now that I'm just popping over to the GitHub page, I realize that there have been even more scripts added to the code, and I just have to upgrade the firmware on my Europis, and I'll have access to those also. The Europi is like a control voltage or CV Swiss Army knife in your rack. I highly recommend this project. Now the last module here is made by a Turkish company, so I dare not pronounce the brand name because I'm not sure how to do that. But it's a shift register, and I use it as a step sequencer that spits out trigger signals for my drum envelopes. So I'm basically using it to make drum and percussion patterns. All right, so we've reached the last category of modules, and here we have all of the really important stuff like mixers, amplifiers, and utilities. And when I say utilities, I'm really just talking about mults. And a mult is a shitty mixer or a shitty splitter. Depends on how you use it. There's no electronics in it. It doesn't even take power to run. Now, there are active mults out there that are powered, and they're useful for certain things, but in my case, in my rack, I don't mind that maybe my voltages are dropping a little bit when I'm splitting it too many times. And either way, I have more than what's in the rack, because when you have the mults outside of the rack, they, number one, do not take up any space in the rack, and number two, when stuff gets cluttered on the front, you can take a mult that is external and just move it onto the side with all the cables, or you can move it up on top of the modular and get the cables out of the way that way. Now, apart from shitty mixers, I also have good mixers in here. I have one from something modular called Mix, and then we have the second one here called Motion MTR, and it's actually the result of a collaboration between Robin Vincent on YouTube and haQ. And when Robin heard that I was getting into modular, he decided that he wanted me to have this in my rack. So he called up the guys down in Barcelona, Spain, and said, hey, haQ, just send this guy one of our DIY motion meters. And they did. So I'm very grateful for that. It looks gorgeous. It's a great way of visualizing CV inside your rack, because you can really see what's happening when you've got CV signals in here. But it doesn't quite stop there, because there is yet another mixer in here, in the Utopia from Dreadbox. It's a great utility module. It has an LFO, it's got a pulverizer thing that messes up your sound, but it also has a mult feature, and it mixes, it offsets and inverts. It's great for all of that stuff. Now, all three mixers can mix both CV and audio. There's more that can be said about all of this, but I don't want this video to be an hour long, and we're just going to move on to the VCAs. Now, one thing you might be hearing a lot when you start going into these forums where there's a lot of modular people is the phrase, you can never have enough VCAs. And even though I agree with that, I only have 4 in here. There's the obvious one inside the Moog Mavis, of course. And then there is this one from something modular, which is called Amp. It basically has 2 of them. Lastly, there's this one, which is a module that I made myself. I call it the VC Empire, and it's got a mono VCA, and then it has an amplifier for bringing up levels from smartphones, for instance, or other consumer-grade audio equipment. You see, if you don't amplify those outputs, they're gonna be too low for you to even hear them, along with all the oscillators and everything else that is super loud in a Eurorack. Now, that same problem of a Eurorack being loud is also a problem when you want to get the Eurorack into consumer grade and professional equipment, because the Eurorack level output is loud, so you need to bring it down. And this is why I opted in for a Pro output module with balanced outputs. And with this, I get the cleanest possible signal out from my rack into my sound interface, which also sports balanced inputs. So yeah, it's a great module for stuff like this. And there, we've gone through all of the modules in this little system, this first part of my Dream Sound Lab. Alright, so this is gonna sound weird to a lot of people, but when I look at a sound making product, my brain breaks it down into the parts that thing has been made up of, and then I look at their configurations. And very often in a finished product, everything has been pre-routed for you, and there's not really much you can do in the forms of rearranging them or reconnecting them. After doing this for so many years, I no longer feel challenged by what regular stuff presents me with. And nowadays, I just want to be creative with how I use these parts instead, the way I connect them, the way I route them, and I want to do weird stuff, unintuitive stuff, things that might not be that useful. And the reason for doing this is because there are plenty of things out there that I'm gonna end up loving or hating, and I'm not gonna find them unless I poke and prod everything. And the only system that will truly allow me to do all of those things is a modular system like this. Here, I get to be the top boss. I get to decide how many parts I put in, what type of parts, in what configurations, how I connect them up, in all of the unintuitive ways I want. I decide everything. And here is a huge challenge, because even though the modular scene is a niche within a niche within a niche, there is so much available out there. Anything you could possibly think up, someone else has already thought up, and someone has already sold a batch of those modules. And that's also a problem. Whenever you find something that you do like, you might not be able to get your hands on it. And then you're spending a lot of time on forums asking about modules similar to the one that you wanted to get initially. And you'll get a lot of answers because modular people are often very, very helpful. It's a great community. In any case, the challenge of trying to find the right stuff and having it be available to you is pretty great. You have to do a lot of research, and I enjoy that challenge. Also, I like there to be a clear theme, and I like there to be a red thread going through everything. And that kind of thinking is not just something I apply to my videos and the way I make my videos, but also it stretches out into the real world, whether I'm making sounds or I'm making music or when I'm building my own sound lab. There's a lot of challenges here, and I'm enjoying them all. Now, the site you've seen me scroll through here in the background is Modular Grid. And if you want to get into modular and you want to start planning your own rack, that's what you get to do here. Now, to get back on the topic of challenges, there is another challenge here, because not only did I choose a very involved project like building a modular, no, I also did it in the most cumbersome, time-consuming way. DIY. And why in the world would I ever want to go that route? Well, you see, I have been a DIYer since my early teens. It started out with me just learning how to build speakers. Then I got to school and I was studying to become a car mechanic. And back then, cars weren't really computers on wheels. Had they been, we might have been, learning about coding, but we didn't. We learned about electrical systems and how to fix them. And so they taught you about electronics and soldering, and they taught you about many of these things you need to know when you start DIYing. So I already had all of that knowledge before I even started building my own guitar pedals, spring reverb, doing something so complex as a full MIDI controller. This is like 25 years ago. And so I've missed it. And what is better to DIY than a modular system? Because there is a ton of modules you need for a sound lab. Because a sound lab needs to provide you with everything. Envelopes, LFOs. Well, it all amounts to a lot of building. And with building comes another set of challenges. Because before you get to do a lot of building, you do a lot of research. You have to look up all the components needed for a module if you're not buying kits. And that's something I didn't do. Only a few modules came as full kits with all of the components needed in order to build it. The rest of them came as panel and PCB kits or just as PCBs. Meaning you have to make the panel board and you have to make the panel yourself. And that is also fun. And even though those modules end up looking like dog shit because I've done the designs on them, they're still great and so much fun to use, and they're all mine. I love the DIY aspect of this. I love sitting and comparing spreadsheets to one another, trying to figure out if this transistor can actually work as a replacement for this transistor. And for many people, that is just tedious. They don't even want to do that. And it's easier to just go and buy it. But when you do, you are not only paying for the components and all of the other parts that has to be made up for that module, you're not only paying for the brand or the design, you're also paying for someone else's time that it takes to actually build the thing and test the thing and sometimes maybe tune the thing, which is why the price is higher when you're buying a finished pre-built module. But in my case, I had to do all of those things myself. And sometimes it's not perfect. In fact, it's far from perfect. Sometimes I don't even do things to spec. And there's something in this modular community I love, and that is the way that people just like to chalk stuff up to character. You see, if you build a thing in the way it's not supposed to be built, but it still works, and it works a little bit weird, that's just character. That's just flavor. Now, there is one more challenge to talk about here, and that is the fact that this is probably one of the most expensive ways of adding a synthesizer to your studio. Yeah, the challenge is massive, especially when you're strapped for cash. We're going to start by looking at Modular Grid because it tracks two things: the power consumption of modules, which is very important, but we're putting that to the side. And it also checks the prices for all the modules and calculates them for you. So you can get a preliminary price of what a system like this would cost you. And if you're looking at this price and you're thinking to yourself, that's a lot of money, then let me stop you right there because we're not done yet. This price is not correct because there are some things missing. Number one, Modular Grid does not add the cost of a case to this price, and you do need a case. So I'm gonna add the cost of a case that lies in between what I paid for my low-cost case and what you might have to pay for a case that you buy from a more well-known modular or case-making brand. And I'm putting that price around $400. So we're getting closer, but we are still not done because we need to add another price that is missing for LFO slew envelope. And since these modules aren't available pre-built, I am gonna guesstimate a price that if it was available, it would be at least $90. I mean, that price is more like a DIY kit kind of thing, but at least $90. We're gonna add that to the price. All right, we're getting even closer, but we're still not quite done yet because it turns out that I have 5 modules in my system that just do not have realistic street prices. If you look at these modules, you can see that these are the ones that I have DIY'd pretty much kind of from scratch. The cost is so low because basically I haven't paid for any panels or PCBs or other things. I've just paid for the components. And what we're gonna do is to add realistic street prices to them. But let's say that these are low-cost modules, so we're doing 70 a pop. And there is one more thing we're gonna add to this, because you won't be able to do much with your system if you don't have patch cables. So we'll just buy, like 20 cables. So let's add a cost for that. And shut up, you modular people in the back. I know 20 is nothing. You're gonna need 100. But for now, we can do with 20 just to get started. And there we go. This is a way more realistic estimation of what you would have to pay if you went out and bought all of this stuff pre-built. But this is not what I paid. No, here's what I paid. And remember, I spread this cost out over 13 months. Roughly. And I was able to get the cost down because I was DIYing stuff. Let me show you what a good plan can do. So I did this before I started picking out modules on Modular Grid. Here I have listed a bunch of different synthesis methods I wanted to end up with in my modular synth lab. And as you can see, the ones with the green check marks I have added to my modular version 1. And everything that couldn't fit into this case is going to go into another case. But in the case of that case, no pun intended, it's actually going to cost me less in the end. But we need to stay here because here we have a plan. And with this plan, it's easier, not easy, but easier to pick and choose what type of modules you want because now you know what you're looking for. You're not walking into this completely blind. This meant that I did not end up like a beginner buying things I didn't know if I needed. So the real power here is that when you know what you want and you have planned for building maybe these 5 modules, you can take all of their BOMs or bills of materials, which lists exactly what components you need, and put them all in one document and start bulk buying. 1 month you're buying just the op amps and maybe some resistors and condensers. The next month you're buying all of the jacks and pots. The month after that something else. And it takes you several months to actually collect all of the components you need. But now you're paying less per unit because instead of paying $1 per op amp, since you're buying 100 of them, you're paying a few cents per unit. And this goes along with every component that you're buying, and you're paying less in shipping because you're buying bulk. You don't have to ship 30 packages, you're shipping 10 packages. The prices go down very quickly, but you have to plan. You have to research. You have to double check every order, and you have to have a lot of patience. And I'll admit to you right now that I didn't follow this plan exactly. You see, sometimes I forgot to order something because I hadn't noted it down properly, or I forgot to check something on the BOM, or I ordered the wrong thing and had to reorder the correct thing. So there was some extra shipping involved. And when we're talking shipping, this much is shipping and sometimes even toll because some of the components weren't available in my area, not even in Europe. I had to order it from the US. And so yeah, it sometimes stings, but shipping is something we do pay. So let's put the money back and forget about it. But there is something we can reduce the cost for here, and that is the amount of pimping that I've done. Like I said earlier in this video, I like there to be a clear theme, and there is a clear theme here. I don't know if you can see it, but if we look closer, the colored strips here on the side, this color pattern you'll find on the custom-made epoxy knobs on the front here. And you can also see that same color scheme in the anodized screws and anodized washers hidden behind the screws. Even my patch cables have this color scheme. I even put the Utopia Dreadbox module in the orange section of my modular. And of course, the moo-moos are so important. Now, for me, the visual and the audible is just as important. And I couldn't have built this without doing this because this was one way of making this project truly mine. So if we remove the cost for the custom pimping I did, and we just replaced the knobs, for instance, with some low-cost knobs and the screws with low-cost screws and things like that, then this would have been the final price. But it's not. This is what I paid in the end, and for me, it was very much worth it. The first thing I want to say is that you don't have to go the hardware route and you don't have to spend a lot of money. The easiest way to obtain this Modular People way of working is by going the software route. So if you are a desktop or laptop user, then I would highly recommend Rack. It's the closest thing to a Eurorack system you can get. There is a bunch of modules available and you can just get going with stuff like this and learn synthesis that way. Now, there is another one called Cardinal, and it basically is like VCV Rack, only it's been optimized to run inside DAWs as a plugin. Now, since modules have to be pre-compiled with the Cardinal code, there is less of them available, but it is also a free download available over at GitHub. And the project is open source, so anyone can contribute to it. If you are an iOS user, then there's MyRack, and it offers a lot, even though it doesn't offer as much modules as VCV Rack does. It also contains some in-app purchases, but 3 of them are basically tipping jars. And then there's one that unlocks the ability to use AUV3s from within MyRack, which is pretty dope. But there is a lot available, so if you want to try out a Befaco Rampage before you take the plunge and buy one or a DIY kit, then you can actually do that. Now, if you're an Android user, then there isn't really anything like MyRack or VCV Rack, but there is, if I remember correctly, Hexen, and then there is, of course, Sunvox. So you can get your modular fill just from those apps. Now, let's say you really do feel like you want to go the hardware route. How do you get around all of these amazingly big prices on some of these modules? Because there are modules out here that costs just as much as an entire desktop synth. Well, if you want to go the hardware route and you don't want to spend too much money, then one option is actually getting a desktop semi-modular synthesizer, something like a Moog Mavis, because here you're getting a complete unit. But let's say you want to go straight to modular. One thing I did was I perused the webs and I went into the back rooms of the internet and I opened every door and I didn't care what monsters was behind them. And it turns out that most of these monsters weren't really monsters, because when you turned on the lights, it was just a nerd wearing a weird, yeah, that's me by the way. So there are third-party developers out there that have brand names that aren't that well known, and they exist on Etsy, Tindy, eBay, and I bought a lot of kits from them, but you can also buy modules from them. And then there is also a company which I don't support on my channel anymore for various reasons, and before you get angry at me for that, let me just say that I'm perfectly fine with you going and buying their really cheap stuff. Now, mind you, you get what you pay for in those cases, because some of it is really, really cheap and really plasticky. Now, let's say you want to go the DIY route and you don't know much about DIY, then you can start out with the Erica Synths educational series. A whole system would cost you about 600 euros and you don't have to buy it all at once. But yeah, it's an affordable way of getting into the DIY scene and learning about synthesis, because all of these modules have been developed in collaboration with Maurice Klein. And Maurice Klein's YouTube channel is a gold mine for this type of knowledge. But the question is still on the table: should you really get into this? And my answer is, you're gonna have to want this, because there are other aspects here that you might not think of. Working with something like this is way more akin to working with lab equipment than just a musical instrument, because you have to consider things like voltages, voltage ranges, and the types of currents. You got AC current and DC current. Not only that, if you buy an older module, it turns out that maybe that module doesn't have a shrouded IDC connector, where it's possible to connect the poles the wrong way, and then you end up frying the module when you turn it on if it's badly designed and doesn't have any protection diodes in there. Worst case scenario, the surge feeds back and burns 10 more modules for you. That can actually happen. On top of that, there is power consumption to think about. Every module needs power, and if you end up cramming in a bunch of smaller modules like 2 HP, 3, 4 HP, 6 HP modules just to be able to fit more modules into your case, well, you might end up reaching the limit of your PSU without really thinking about it. So you need to constantly check for that. Now here I want to take a bit of a breather, because this is all starting to sound very, very bad and negative and hard, as if you have to be some kind of a engineer or technician to do this, and that's not the case. There are loads of good resources available online where you can learn the basics and you don't have to go the DIY route. If you get past that hurdle, if you feel like you really want this, then let me tell you that there is no project that is so rewarding to build such as a modular system like this. It is an extremely personal experience. You're putting yourself in there. You're the boss. You decide what the end result will be, the configuration, the looks, everything. And if you have OCD, you can go wild. For instance, I would never ever put a module into my case with a white panel. I hate white panels. I don't want anything to do with them. It's probably sounding silly to some of you, but that's just the way it is. And a lot of modular people have OCD like this. Some will only build with black panels, and you get to do all of that yourself too. You can be as ridiculous as you want. A modular synth like this is a personal thing. And I have been immensely rewarded from putting all of that time, all of that effort into building it. And for that reason, I do recommend getting into it. Modular People music. I love it. Now, before you leave, why don't you give me a thumbs up? And if you don't want to support me in my work here, just give me a thumbs up. And I want to thank you so much for watching this video. And if you watched through all of it, I am very, very, very grateful. I love you. You're insane. As usual, I wish you a very productive week. Now go finger all of your stuff and have a lot of fun doing it.